Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight it will be a tour de force in terms of an opportunity to look not only at a country, but 54 countries, a continent that is emerging as a superpower in the 21st century. 54 countries, very diverse, two powerhouses, South Africa and Nigeria. Our speaker tonight is a friend, as well as someone who has had a enormously successful and distinguished career, both in foreign service and in public service within the National Security Council and at the State Department. Multiple ambassadorships, a man who has met the good, the bad, and the ugly. Very provocative title for his book, The Mind of the Strong Man. And I asked him tonight, what about the mind of the strong woman? Because there's a few of those in Africa too. And there's a big commitment in our organization, as I know in Herman's work, to the fact that diversity is a great strength. And we need more in terms of advocacy for diversity to bring change to Africa. Some of you may have seen in the Post that by 2050, 2 billion plus people will live on the continent of Africa. More than 1 billion of them will be under the age of 25. Also, the population of Nigeria is projected to surpass the population of the United States by 2050, which will rank it about number 5th in the world in terms of population. I was very pleased to see Jonathan Goodluck, the president of Nigeria, a strong man, have the strength of his convictions to step down and permit a peaceful transition in a democratic process to permit the duly elected new president of Nigeria to take over the reins. Some of you may be aware that Mo Ibrahim has an annual prize that is given for African leaders who have demonstrated true leadership by stepping down in a democratic manner to permit others who have been elected by their people to take their country forward in the 21st century. Only 4 of those awards were given in the last 9 years. 4 were deemed worthy, but that's a start. Of course, the prize is small. It's only $5 million in cash deposited into your personal bank account. And when you're talking about the sort of money that many of these people are in control of, that's kind of chump change. It's important, it's symbolic, and we want more of it, but I don't think money will be the motivator for the strong man or strong woman of Africa who occupy power in what has been a post-colonial system that's been dominated by dynasties, whether tribal, family, or inner circle. Those who've been close to those who've been elected to power or have taken power tend to want to stay there regardless of what their constitutions may say. I'm sure that Ambassador Cohen will address these issues and many more tonight. Transparency, accountability, corruption. Very often in Africa, it's said that oil and natural resources can either be a blessing or a curse. That depends on who the leader of that particular country is. The man who's our speaker tonight knows of which he speaks because he's dealt with some of the strong men, strong leaders in Africa. He's also dealt with the great Mandela, as well as Gaddafi, Mugabe, and many others who are well known in terms of the type of reporting that we get here in the United States as we attempt to encourage Western-style democracy in a continent that's just kind of morphing its way towards that. So, two things about Herman Cohen. What you hear is factual, verifiable. He's been there, he's done it. He's been at the coal face. He's been a man who has dedicated his life to helping to change our world and make it a better place for this and future generations. He's also helping to bring African television to the United States in conjunction with one of our board members, Dr. Yahya Musa. And that will bring African program content, starting with South Africa and Nigeria, being broadcast nationally in the United States, 6 hours a day, news, current events, and other serious programming to an American audience. In my opinion, there's still a huge ignorance gulf between American understanding of the 54 nations that constitute the continent of Africa and what's really happening on the ground in Africa. Herman has been a bridge builder. He's been recognized for it not only in the United States, but worldwide. He's a man of peace. He's dedicated to the values that we in the World Affairs Council DC share. And it's my great honor to introduce Ambassador Herman Cohen.
Thank you very much, Tony. It was a wonderful introduction. And I think we'll start. I want to welcome you all and thank you for giving some time to Africa. I think I'll start out by testing you a little bit, see what you know about the U.S.-Africa connection. And some of the people here I know who know more than I do should not talk, please. Okay. All right, we have a map of Africa here. How does it compare in size to the U.S.? Who's going to give me a figure? I have no. 8 times. 8 times? Any other idea? Well, it's about 3.5. 3.5. You could put U.S., Canada, and China in the map of Africa. It'll fit in pretty good. Okay. Now, colonization of Africa by Europeans started around 1800, and it continued on till 1885 when they had the Congress of Berlin, where all of the European colonizers settled all the borders and what have you. Now, at that point, there were only 2 countries in Africa that were not colonized. Who could tell me which ones they were? Ethiopia and who else? Liberia, okay. Liberia would have loved to be colonized, but we didn't want them. Okay, now the last question is, if the United States became a federal republic in 1789, Africa was being colonized by the Europeans. We had a great navy. Why didn't we have colonies in Africa? We could have gone on and picked off some colonies. Who could tell me why we didn't do it?
Europeans were already there.
No, we could have competed with them. Yeah, we could have shot their boats out of the water, right? Yeah.
Busy expanding westward.
That's it. We were busy expanding westward. Don't forget, Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase, 1803, right? He paid for that with worthless bonds. He paid the French government to take that away. Okay, so going west was more important for Americans than going to Africa. Now, we did have Americans going to Africa. They were mainly missionaries. And they sent out bad reports because they were succumbing to disease. After a while, the missionaries were saying, Africa is the white man's grave. There was a lot of malaria and that sort of thing. So that was a double reason why Americans didn't have any colonies in Africa. Okay. So flash forward to the late 1950s and early 1960s. I was starting out my career as a junior Foreign Service officer, and we were advised by the personnel people that you should specialize because the world was becoming very complex. So I looked at Africa and I saw all these countries were becoming independent. And I thought that's very exciting, and I took my master's degree and I did some work on economic development. I said, should be very interesting. So I volunteered, and with the family, we all went off to Uganda and then went to what is now Zimbabwe, Zambia, and the Congo for our first 8 years in Africa. And also, the policy laid down by the President of the United States, the first President of the United States who had to make policy on Africa, was President Dwight Eisenhower, because that's when the country was becoming independent. And he had a very big debate in the National Security Council. I've been reading the archives. And he had to decide between the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the Vice President, Richard Nixon, what would our policy be? And the Secretary of State said, Cold War. The Africans have to choose. Are you with us or against us? Vice President Nixon said, no, that's a bad decision. They're becoming independent. We've got to let them do their thing, and let them be neutral in the Cold War. We don't want to get the Cold War here. So Eisenhower decided in favor of Nixon. No Cold War in Africa. So as a young guy, I thought that was great. No Cold War, and economic development is the big thing. So we went off to Uganda and Zimbabwe, and the US was just swarming with people coming in to help out on economic development. We had all sorts of experts, various fields, education, health, agriculture. We're just pouring into sub-Saharan Africa. I remember when we were in Zimbabwe, we had a gentleman from the Center for Disease Control. His name was Dr. Dame. So I asked him, Dr. Dame, what are you here for? He said, I'm going to eliminate tsetse fly. I said, how are you going to do that? He said, well, I'm going to breed 700 million males, and I'm going to sterilize them and let them loose, and they won't be able to reproduce. That will kill the tsetse fly. Well, I left that place before I could tell, but I don't think he succeeded. Okay, so now we were concentrating on economic development. And, you know, we were the guys who also started the Kenya airlift, which brought President Obama's father. So if you want to blame Obama on me, you can do that. Okay, so while we were concentrating on that, the new leaders of Africa, the people I write about in my book, they had to make some decisions. What kind of policies are we going to have? So in terms of economics, they consulted their friends in Europe, mainly the French Socialist Party and the British Labour Party. And the advice that they got was nationalize everything, all enterprises. So you want to push fast on economic development, that's the way to do it. The state owns everything and you'll move ahead. And they did it. They did it correctly. They paid compensation. They did plantations, banks, insurance companies, small manufacturing, transportation, and they paid compensation, and the owners took the money and left. So they were there left to manage these things. On the political side, they inherited Western-style multi-party democracies, 2-house parliament, elections, and that sort of thing. And they went through that for a few years, and they decided they didn't like it. They said, this doesn't fit in with African culture. Western-style democracy is adversarial. Just look at the British Parliament on C-SPAN. See how they insult each other all the time, you know, resign, resign. The Africans said, we don't like that. We like consensus building. The village chief, he gathers everyone around, and we talk and talk and talk, and finally we get a consensus. So that's the kind of politics we want. So they rejected Western democracy, and they created something called a one-party state, whereas there's only one party, and everybody belongs to it, and within that party you work out solutions to problems, you see. Also, the one-party state co-opted everything else, the media and civil society. So the labor unions, the women's groups, the youth groups, they're all part of the single party. And that's the way they started to govern. And in terms of our interest in economic development, they did everything wrong. And it just totally went against everything we were trying to do. Why was that? Well, on the economic side, when the government owned all these enterprises, there was a tremendous demand from the constituents to give jobs to people. You know, anybody in the rural areas who had a education, elementary school education, go to the city and get a job. So the government was under a lot of pressure to give jobs. So all of these enterprises that they nationalized was bloated with employees. And after a few years, they all started losing money. And in order to keep them going, they had to take money from other places, like healthcare, infrastructure, defense, you name it, all the government activities. And it started a vicious cycle, because the more money that was taken away from essential services, the less private business was interested in investing. And things deteriorated. Roads, telecommunications, electricity, they all deteriorated. So that was totally against economic development. Now, on the political side, the one-party state meant no opposition was allowed, right? So it's okay in a village where you work things in consensus, but for a national level, if there's no opposition, what do you do with people who are unhappy, who start talking against the government? Well, they have to be arrested if they don't shut up. And slowly but surely, the one-party state became very authoritarian and very corrupt, because the party became more important than the government. And careerists in the party thought this was the way to make money. So while we were pushing economic development, government decisions were working in the opposite direction. Now, if any one of these original leaders that I write about in my book had gotten a staff meeting going in their first days and say, tell me how to make our economies go backward 5% a year, they couldn't have done a better job. Excuse me. Okay, so another thing, our policymakers told us out in the field, do not criticize. These governments are new, they're making their own way, they're making their own decisions. Do not criticize. We recognize their sovereignty, we have an embassy in every country, but so we saw all this going on, but we couldn't criticize. All right, so this went on, and till about 1975, things were going on, but 1975, the things that Africa sold to the rest of the world, agricultural, tropical agricultural products, minerals like copper, iron ore, they took a collapse. Prices went down, just like they've recently gone down since China stopped buying. And a lot of African governments were in deep trouble because they were borrowed money at commercial rates, and they've had a hard time paying back. So we, who were not allowed to criticize, kept saying, well, what do we do? They're in deep trouble. So finally, we had to find a bad cop who could go to these countries and say, look here, you're going to shape up. Who do you think the bad cop was? Who? IMF and the World Bank. That's right. We didn't criticize. You know, we were the nice guys. Okay, so they came in and said, you know, when you see on television these ads that say, is your credit card debt too high? Are you having trouble? Well, if you call this 800 number, we'll take care of it. Well, the World Bank was kind of like that. They said, look, you're paying commercial rates for your debt. You can't handle it. We've got a deal for you. We'll wipe out your debts. Of course, we'll take over the debt, and you will pay us back with a 10-year grace period and 1% interest. Well, I call that free money. But you have to sign this document which talks about economic reform and all the things you'll promise to do. And every African country signed on, which meant that they had to change their exchange rates, they had to stop inflation, they had to get rid of non-performing businesses, a whole list of reforms that they had to do. And this worked. because of these World Bank reforms, within a few years, most of the African governments stopped going backwards on their economies and started growing again. Not sensational like Malaysia and Korea, but say 3% a year and that sort of thing. So by the time we got to the late 1980s, most African economies were fairly healthy. All right, but we still didn't see real good growth. 3% a year for an emerging economy is really not enough. Yeah, the Chinese were doing 9, 11%, same thing for South Korea. So we had to look for other solutions. Excuse me. And then, so that's what people started to become very creative. And I think the first United States administration that started to think beyond the traditional foreign aid was George H.W. Bush, with the administration that I worked in as Assistant Secretary for Africa. And what we were thinking was, really, in order to get good growth in Africa, you need investors. And not only do you need foreign investors, you need indigenous investors. Local people have to be investing to start enterprises. So George H.W. Bush, through AID, started a program of encouraging governments to set up a good environment to encourage investors. You've probably read about this USAID who died recently in a US raid. He was a hostage in Pakistan, Mr. Weinstein. He was the one who started that program of creating a good environment for investors. So we started looking outside the box. Then in came President Clinton, and he signed in his last year in office something called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which said to the Africans, anything you can make, you can export to the United States duty-free. This was an act of Congress, and this was a tremendous advantage. You know, if somebody in Tanzania makes a lady sweater and can send it to the US duty-free, it's cheaper than Hong Kong, or it's cheaper than a Chinese lady sweater. This is a big deal. And so that we advanced one more step in bringing business to Africa. Then came George W. Bush, who was very creative. He was very creative in terms of Africa policy. With George W. Bush, you had the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was started, which said, well, we'll set up a list of criteria, and the countries that do best on the criteria, which will be judged by independent entities like the World Bank and Freedom House, and those that do well, will give them large chunks of money and negotiate programs with them. And that has been quite a successful operation. And George W. Bush, of course, also had the PEPFAR program, which was a strong attack on HIV and really reduced the prevalence of HIV in Africa. He also persuaded the World Bank to stop lending money to African countries, but to give grants. So I think George W. Bush was really terrific. Now, what is Obama's thing? Now, Obama has looked at Africa and said, they're really ready to take off, but there's some very serious deficits. Now, let's attack those deficits. What are they? Well, there's electric power. 600 million Africans don't have access to regular electric power. So how are you going to run a small business without regular electric power? So President Obama has started something called Power Africa, which is not going to build power plants for Africans with US taxpayer money. But what President Obama is trying to do is to encourage American companies to invest in power and sell electricity to the utilities in Africa. I'm a consultant to a US company called Contour Global, which has so far built 5 power plants in Africa, and they're doing very well. We're selling the power. We invested the money and we're selling the power. Also, the second biggest deficit is agriculture. Africa makes most of its money through selling commodities abroad. It's minerals and agriculture. For example, Cote d'Ivoire is the biggest producer of cocoa in the world, and Ghana is the second biggest producer of cocoa in the world. So this chocolate comes from Africa. Now, what do they do with that money that they make? They have to import food because they're not producing enough food for themselves. So this doesn't make sense. You have all this agricultural land, and you have to import food. So President Obama started something called Food for Africa, which says what you need is better yields, better seeds, better storage, better farm-to-market roads, and better irrigation. And I know the African farmer, they take to technology very well. So if they get technology, they can do it. And I already see things happening in certain countries, like in Nigeria, cassava is becoming very big. Cassava starch is a big important commodity for people to consume. So things are working out pretty well in terms of US policy. And another thing that I like about Obama's policy is that he speaks truth to power. Obama, being of African ancestry, is saying things to the Africans that no other US president has ever said. You need better governance, stop the corruption, get better democracy, don't have fake elections, and that sort of thing. And he's saying no other president has said that, and he can get away with it because he's part African. You see. So that's why I think US policy is on the right track. Okay, now what is the outlook? What is the outlook for Africa? So far, the countries that should be the wealthiest are not doing so well because they have large sources of oil or large sources of copper, and unfortunately, the big revenue that they're getting is not going toward poverty reduction. For example, Nigeria is the biggest producer of oil in Africa, something like 2 million barrels a day. Poverty rates keep going up. And by the way, don't be fooled by this stuff you read in The Economist magazine. Nigeria's gross domestic product is going up 5% a year, 7% a year. That means that the oil price is going up. It doesn't mean that people are making money, you see. So I think if the big earners, like Congo, which is a big earner of copper and other minerals, and Nigeria and Angola, which are the big earners on oil, if they could start spending money on poverty reduction, I think things would go well. But and the countries I think that are doing best are the ones without these resources. They have no choice. They have to innovate. So where is Ford Motor Company starting a production plant right now? In Kenya, because they're hard workers, they're good investors, they're good businessmen, and they don't have resources, you see. So in terms of the outlook, I would say the glass is half full. And when some of these governments can really get down to it and start thinking about poverty reduction rather than filling our own pockets or helping our families, I think things will greatly improve. And as far as US policy is concerned, I think it's right on the mark. It's a very good policy. And basically, you can't bring development to Africa. They have to develop themselves and take all the right policy steps in order to create the good atmosphere for their own people to invest money. So let me stop there and see if you have any questions.
Ambassador Cohen, my question is based on the development of the Chinese African Development Bank and the enormous amount of money that China is pouring into its geopolitical relationship with multiple countries throughout Africa. Thank you.
Well, I have never heard anyone in US government say that we are competing with China in Africa. China has its own objectives in Africa which do not really undermine our policies or our objectives. basically China, up until recently when they started slowing down their economy, was a big importer of commodities. And Africa is a great source of commodities, especially oil and minerals, iron ore especially. And when China and also India were really importing tremendous amounts, they wanted to make deals with suppliers. So what did China do? Well, they went to African countries and said, look, Angola, if you can supply 200,000 barrels a day, we'll pay world prices, but if you guarantee us that prices, we'll help you with infrastructure. And we're not going to give you gifts. We'll lend you, we'll do soft loans and help you improve your infrastructure or whatever else you need. And these are just good business deals, and China has been doing that in many countries in Africa, and a lot of African countries have benefited from that. Okay, but there's a downside. There is a downside. Chinese have troubles relating to Africans. So when they go in and say they bring in a construction company to build roads or dams or bridges, they bring in their own labor. I've seen them in Charles de Gaulle Airport, you know, teams of 100 people with red baseball caps. And they go around on command, and these are the workers that the Chinese companies, not the government, the Chinese companies are bringing in. So this offends Africans because, hey, we got our labor too, why don't you hire our guys? And so after the Chinese get the point and they start hiring Africans, they treat them very badly. I had a student at American University, not American, at SAIS, and one of my students went to Africa to study the Chinese. And she went to a Chinese company working a mine there, and she looked at how the working conditions were, and she went to the manager and said, why are you treating these people so poorly? And she said, and they said, we're treating them just like we treat our Chinese workers in China, which of course is poorly. And also there's no development of management. American, European companies in Africa try to develop Africans into management positions. Look at Chevron in Angola. The top people are all Angolans. They're not Americans. So anyway, China has trouble relating, and some countries are now pushing back. For example, the Zambians and the Ethiopians have said, well, you can't bring in more than 5% workers. So, but generally speaking, I would say what China is doing in Africa is not bad. It's pretty good for the Africans, and it's helping with their development.
You haven't mentioned warfare. And during that very long period that you've talked about, there have been an awful lot of civil wars, Nigeria, Angola, fighting that seems to go on for decades in the Congo. Would you talk a bit about the propensity for infighting?
Okay, well that's a very important question. I did not talk about instability in Africa. And by the way, President Eisenhower, when he was making decisions about US policy, so the problem came up, well, what do you do about instability? How do you do stabilization in Africa when things fall apart? And he made a very important decision. He said, only the UN. He said, no NATO or American troops on the ground in Africa. And I thought this was a wise decision, because when the former Belgian Congo, which was not very well prepared for independence, the Belgians sort of, well, they didn't allow anyone to go to school beyond high school. And when Belgium gave independence to the Congo, they only had about 20 university graduates, people who had sneaked out and gone to university. So things fell apart fairly quickly, and there was a great deal of instability in the Congo. And the Soviets were there trying to undermine various politicians and what have you. So this became the first UN peacekeeping operation directed by New York that ever was done. And it was a fairly successful one. So what caused a lot of instability in Africa? Well, there was poor preparation for independence in places like the Congo, Angola. Also, remember I talked about the one-party state. Well, a lot of the one-party states, or some of the one-party states, became very corrupt and also minority ruled. You know, for example, Cameroon. I don't know if you see where Cameroon is on the map up here. Where are we? Right here. Cameroon is ruled by one ethnic group that only represents 11% of the population. Ethiopia is similar. And when you have that, as you have in some countries in the Middle East right now, there's a lot of resentment and instability develops. There's also, for example, the Ethiopians were controlling Eritrea against the will of the people of Eritrea. There was an insurgency in Angola. All of this comes from poor governance and poor preparation for independence. And the US policy has always been UN first when you need stabilization operations, and US help with mediation. And that was my main job during the Bush 41 administration. We devoted all of our efforts to try and settle wars in Africa, and we were very successful in Mozambique and in Ethiopia. Less successful in other places, but we gave our big effort, and I think United States deserves a lot of credit for helping stabilize unstable countries.
When I saw the topic of the book, I was looking forward to hearing the viewpoints and thoughts of the African dictators, their mindset. And so actually I came with my question that it's good to learn what the Africans think, but if you look at the history of dictators in Africa, a majority of them have been supported from Washington. Even now, you have Egypt, you have Rwanda, you have Uganda. So that it seems to me that the debate we need in Washington is to see whether 50 years of US support for many African dictators has been good for the US or good for Africa. So basically, I'm thinking, while this is good, the debate has to be, why do we have so many African dictators, and what support do they get from outside? Because now as we speak, you have Hissène Habré on trial in Dakar. He was put in power by Mr. Reagan. You have the Rwandans, you have the Ugandans, even Egypt now gets lots of support from Congress. So my question is, what is the US history of not supporting democracies in Africa? And finally, if you indulge me, actually Ambassador Cohen, I've known him for a while and he's been wonderful to me. So I feel nervous throwing out this question, but it's all in the fun of extracting another viewpoint. So thank you very much.
Well, that's a very important question. I remember when I was a young chargé d'affaires in the Congo, I was too young to be called ambassador, but yes, I was in charge of the embassy. And there was a very distinguished French ambassador there. His name was Kosciuszko Morizet. He then later became ambassador to the UN and ambassador to Washington. And his granddaughter has been a minister. In many ways, a famous family. And we were really frustrated by the Congolese government, by President Mobutu, one of the chief dictators, and their way they were acting and stealing money and what have you. So being a much younger guy, I said to him, Mr. Ambassador, how can we deal with these people? It's so difficult. He said, let me tell you, young man, you deal with what exists. And that is the answer. These people exist. We were not in the business of overturning dictators and telling them, you must leave. And by the way, when we do tell them, you must leave, look what happens. We told Gaddafi, you must leave, and a few other people. In 1991, when I was assistant secretary, there was great chaos in the city of Kinshasa. The presidential guard was mutinying, and there was chaos. So we had to make sure that the foreigners could be taken out, so they wouldn't get hurt. So we sent a battalion of troops to Brazzaville across the river. You see where the two Congos meet, and you have Kinshasa and Brazzaville. So we sent a battalion of troops to Brazzaville to help get the foreigners out. And the French sent troops inside Kinshasa to do the same thing. So I wrote a little note to the Secretary of State. I say, you know, Mobutu's been really impossible. This might be a good opportunity to get rid of him. So the Secretary of State said, I've torn up your memo. I don't want anybody to see it. I say, why? He said, never get rid of anyone until you know what's coming afterward. And I think we've learned our lesson. So we have to work with what exists. And of course, we want to support democracy. We've put hundreds of millions of dollars into Africa in support of democracy, civil society. I think we've had some impact. And a number of African governments have adopted multi-party. And they're going slowly, and I think they're getting there. But when you say, do not support dictators, I don't know what the alternative is.
I'm wondering if you could talk about Senegal a little bit. I know Senegal is relatively unique in West Africa because it's never experienced a coup, to my knowledge. So I'm wondering if you could talk about your observations about what was unique about Senegal that contributed to that stability.
Well, I have a chapter in my book on Léopold Senghor, who was the founding president of Senegal. It's very interesting that Senegal is 95% Muslim, and their first president was a Catholic, and it showed how tolerant those people are. And the whole Sufi Islam, which is prevalent in West Africa, is a very, very tolerant form of Islam. I remember Christmas time, the streets of the capital city of Dakar were lit up with Christmas trees. You know, these 95% Muslim, they loved Christmas and they gave gifts and that sort of thing. So it was a great place to work, but they suffered from all the other problems. They had a party that was always in power, that was never defeated, and they had corruption issues. People in the party took care of each other. For example, if a businessman who was in the party, he could get free, he could bring in his Coca-Cola free of duty, while all the other importers had to pay duty. So corruption was a big problem. Also, development, attention to the rural areas was a big problem. I used to travel a lot in the rural areas. I hardly ever found a doctor. I have hardly ever found an agricultural extension worker. There's sort of a terrific neglect of the rural areas. But I think things are improving. The latest president, Macky Sall, is a part of the new generation, well-educated, and he really understands what economic development is. The company I'm working with, we just signed a deal to build a new power plant there. And I think they really have a vocation for reducing poverty. And I think it's going to be a success story, in my view.
My name is David Shupak. First of all, thank you for your kind words about the Peace Corps. I was a volunteer in Mozambique. So I also spent a lot of time in South Africa. In both of those countries, there are small parties, MDM and the DA, that have won municipal elections and are able to grow their reputation by having good city managers and good city governance. And I was wondering what hope, if any, you saw for those parties becoming legitimate contenders on the national stage.
Well, South Africa, of course, is a separate country. They obtained democracy and majority rule, and it was already had a very big industrial base, and it had a big agricultural base. So it's quite different from the rest of Africa, and the potential is much greater. Now, the party that led South Africa to majority rule against the terrible apartheid system, the African National Congress, they're still very popular, and they win all the elections. But in the western part of South Africa, right here, the population is different ethnically. They have a lot of people who are designated racially as coloreds, mainly they're descended from mixed marriages, mainly from Malaysian slaves and Dutch people. And they have a different politics, and they've elected a minority party in South Africa that has a wonderful record for management. I remember my wife Suzanne and I went on a cruise and the last stop was Cape Town. This was about 5 years ago. I've never seen such a clean, well-maintained city. It's better than Washington. It's fantastic. And this is because these people in power in the Western Cape province are very serious about good governance. And people are starting to notice. Now, the reason this party has not done better is because the leaders are all white people. And still, so the majority of the Africans still vote for their African National Congress. But just recently, an African, a black African, has been installed as president of the Democratic Party. And it looks like they're making an effort to move toward the majority point of view. And I think they're totally a role model for good government in South Africa. And I hope what they're doing catches on with the rest of the country.
You talked about some of the policy initiatives that the US government has had in Africa to try and help Africa and countries develop. And it seems to me, talking to a lot of people in the State Department, USAID, and other agencies, that the focus now is moved very much to capacity building. And that seems to be the big buzzword everywhere, although a lot of people in the government don't quite seem to know exactly what it means. It seems to be something that they're aware that they need to do, and they're aware they need to get the private sector involved. But the US private sector has been very reluctant to move into Africa. Issues of poor governance, etc. What do you think the US government can do to try and encourage US businesses to focus on Africa?
Well, the president had the summit meeting a year ago, a little over a year ago, and the whole emphasis was on promoting private sector investments. There's a US organization called the Corporate Council on Africa, which has about 250 US corporations which do business in Africa. It's sort of like a chamber of commerce. I have a little consulting firm, and I'm a member of that. And so I attend their meetings, and basically they talk about the problems that prevent them from moving ahead in investment. Although lately there's been some things happening with the high prices for commodities until very recently. A middle class has developed in Africa. I would say about 10% of sub-Saharan Africa. How do you define middle class? If you're living on more than $20 a day, it means you have disposable income. You know, you can buy clothing, you can buy extra clothing, more luxury food, maybe buy a vehicle of some sort. So this has attracted business. Walmart is there. Walmart has about 15 stores now toward the southern part of Africa. Goldman Sachs has an office there. Citibank is expanding in sub-Saharan Africa, which means there's money to be made. There's money to be made. Does that mean that's good for Africans? Not too much. Beyond the small middle class, which lives off commodity earnings, the rural areas are still very poor because there's no development in rural areas. So you talk to American business, what is your biggest problem in going into Africa? And you make a whole checklist. What are the problems? The one thing that's always at the top of the list is rule of law, enforcement of contracts. Any business in the world wants to know when they make a contract, it can be enforced in the courts, right? Because when you make a contract, there's always something wrong, right? There's always something that has to be arbitrated, right? Africa, the rule of law is very weak. I had a personal experience. I had a fishing business in Mauritania. You see it all the way up there? Mauritania has one of the richest fishing grounds in the world because you have the cold waters from the Antarctic meeting up with the warm waters from the Mediterranean. It's great for fish, great for fish. So I had a friend there. I was very popular there because I settled the border issue between Mauritania and Senegal. They were fighting over the border. And I told them the border is at the North Bank. And they said, okay, we accept. So they said, come on and do some business. So I partnered up with with a Mauritanian gentleman who knew the business very well. And we attracted a company from Seattle. And they sent 3 boats over. And they were doing very well. We got a percentage of the catch because we were helping them get crews, get permits, and that sort of thing. And so we got maybe about 15%. And we're doing very well. And after 2 years, the big company in Seattle went bankrupt. Had nothing to do with us in Mauritania. We were doing well. That meant that the people who carried the note suddenly owned the company. So in comes this guy from John Hancock, and he says, I own those boats. I want them. We said, no, you can't have it because they still owe us $500,000. We're not going to give you the boats. Okay, so he gets a lawyer and he goes to court to force us to give up the boats. So I said, well, we got a weak case because the company's bankrupt and these people really own the boats. And he said, don't worry, I know the judge very well. And that's what happened. They had to pay us the $500,000 to get the boats. But it wasn't legal. It wasn't legal. So the rule of law is key. The rule of law is key. Okay.
I'm curious if you have any observations on the strong women of Africa. Are there any differences in governance where women hold more leadership roles, like Liberia, Malawi, Rwanda? Have you observed any differences in governance or any changes, positive changes in terms of poverty reduction?
Yeah, the strong women of Africa, we haven't had too many examples of women heads of state. Mrs. Sirleaf Johnson in Liberia, she had extensive experience. She was a UN civil servant. She ran very big programs of development. And she was a natural selection to be the head of Liberia after their civil war was over. I don't think she has shown very good skills on management. She's had problems. I haven't studied Liberia too closely, but Liberia has not made too much progress since she took over. I tried to sign them up for an independent power plant there, and she had some people from the Texas electric utility who would come back to Liberia, and they were giving us a hard time, so we just dropped out. So she's been good in terms of promoting democracy. She's been very good on that, but she hasn't been good in economic advances, right? So, but anyway, she's been an admirable person. Other heads of state, the current head of state of Central African Republic is really in over her head, and she took over when it was impossible. So nobody could succeed, man or woman, there. Let me see, in Malawi, Mrs. Banda, I think her name was, she got involved with a very heavy corruption problem there. So far, there haven't been enough examples of women leaders, but there have been some terrific women ministers of government, and they've shown very good leadership in many places. The former Minister of Finance in Nigeria, who was very high up in the World Bank, she did an excellent job, I thought, as Minister of Finance. A very competent person in all elements of finance. So the women are coming up. And of course, the spouses of heads of state do have power, and they exercise it in many ways. I remember the former president of Senegal, his name was Abdoulaye Wade, who lost the last election. And when we were in Senegal, he was a politician, and we used to bring him over for dinner, and people would say, watch out for his wife, very ambitious. Very ambitious. So, anyway, they have power too.
You identified a lot of different indicators and causes for instability, and I was curious over your time, what have you seen that was unique? What was kind of like a wild card thing that you don't generally see that caused some kind of turmoil or violence, specifically when dealing with elections?
Causes of instability. I'm glad you brought it up because I didn't mention it in my presentation. If you read my book, especially the president of Cote d'Ivoire, Houphouët-Boigny, call him the great destabilizer. You have something that Africans don't talk about. It's called surrogate wars. Surrogate wars. What happens when there's instability in a country and the next door neighbor decides to help one of the parties, right? You see that in Rwanda and the Congo. The government of Rwanda has helped rebel people in the eastern Congo. And also when Rwanda came into the Congo in 1996 and they toppled the President Mobutu, they had with them Congolese politicians who were political parties. So they say, it's not us, we're not doing it, it's this Congolese political party that's overthrowing Mobutu. That's a surrogate war, where a neighboring country is causing war in another country. And the Africans don't talk about that. They don't talk about it. They don't say, they don't admonish the perpetrators of surrogate wars. And Houphouët-Boigny of Cote d'Ivoire, one of the great statesmen of Africa, one of the most successful. His country has been the most successful economically, the biggest producer of cocoa in the world. And the farmers got good prices. The government didn't steal the money, the cocoa money that came in. They gave it to the farmers. A wonderful president. But he's destabilized all the countries around him. He supported rebels. He supported Charles Taylor, who caused tremendous problems in Liberia, you see. So the surrogate war, I'm glad you brought up the question I didn't mention, has been a very big problem in Africa, destabilizing your neighbor. And another one is this fellow Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso, who was overthrown recently. Burkina Faso, where are you? Let me see. In the blue. Okay. Above Cote d'Ivoire, okay. All right, so they, but anyway, the president of Burkina Faso, Blaise Compaoré, just north of Ivory Coast, and it's a situation where Burkina Faso provides most of the labor for the cocoa farms. It's sort of like people from the Caribbean providing most of the labor for Georgia peaches and Florida crops, a lot of Mexican labor. Well, the success of the Ivory Coast cocoa comes from Burkina Faso workers coming in, and some of them have been there for generations, you know, third, fourth generations there. And the president of Burkina Faso, and he told me this personally, he said, it's because of us that Cote d'Ivoire is rich. And what are we getting out of it? Nothing. He said, what they need is one of our guys to be president of Cote d'Ivoire. He says, and I'm going to arrange it. So he had this terrific guy named Alassane Ouattara, who was managing director of the IMF. He had a tremendous career. He says, I'm going to make him president of Cote d'Ivoire. Okay, how are you going to do that? Okay, well, he started a surrogate war. And for 11 years, Cote d'Ivoire was in a civil war because of this guy in Burkina Faso. And he finally achieved it. Alassane Ouattara is now president of Cote d'Ivoire because this guy in Burkina Faso arranged it. But they went through a terrible civil war, 11 years, tremendous suffering, that sort of thing. Okay, so what happens? His guy is in power, and he said, this is terrific, I'm so happy. I'm going to change the Constitution so I can run for a third term. Tremendous pouring into the streets to protest. Hundreds of thousands of people protest. Why? Because he spent all his money on the war in Cote d'Ivoire, and the people of his country got nothing. So he was forced to run away to Cote d'Ivoire, where he got political asylum from his friend Ouattara, you see. So that's another example of surrogate wars and destabilization of neighbors. It's a flagrant example. And so Compaoré is guilty of two. He's guilty of the Charles Taylor in Liberia and the war in Cote d'Ivoire. Now, what's good, though, there's a good side of this, is Ouattara is a fantastically good president. An economist, he's building, businessmen are pouring into Cote d'Ivoire now tremendously. So it's having a positive outcome, but they really suffered badly because of that war. Thank you very much.